I've pretty much got my Les Paul neck building down to a science with my jigs and everything. I can rough out a neck pretty quickly now with all the different jigs that I have set up. You know, I've got Limba, I've got Honduran Mahogany. I made these two necks relatively quickly. I've got a jig for the tenon, I've got a jig to cut the angle, I've got a profile jig to do the back. So that when you get your neck, it's all set to carve to your liking. Wanted to show you my process today on how I create Les Paul necks and give you actually insights into my jigs and how I use them versus just telling you about them in my last video. So obviously the first thing to do is get a piece of wood. My first cut is always going to be the headstock angle, because everything I do is based off that headstock angle, and if I don't get this cut correct and it's off ever slightly, it just won't look right. It'll kind of throw off the whole neck and it's junk. So this is my table saw that I bought from Sears, the Craftsman table saw, sliding table saw that actually cuts this. Now that you've got it cut to the right angle, you can get your templates from Ronnie over at Guitar Building Templates and start laying out. Laying out your guitar neck is incredibly important, because if it's off ever slightly, you know, you'll get the nut cut wrong, you'll get the tenon cut wrong, and you pretty much ruined a great piece of wood. So I laid this out, get it all set up, and what I want to do is I want to score the piece of wood for my center line for my routing. Here, this is a single-sided score. I've already measured. And what's nice, even if you're not perfectly centered when you do this, you could just flip this over and score on both sides. So I scored the wood the whole way down. I'm going to flip it over and score this side. So now that I've done that, I've got too many lines. I don't know if you can see that, but I know exactly where the center is. So as I'm placing the jigs and drawing around it, I know exactly where my center line is on this guitar, and I can just do it on both sides. So here I'm just going to trace the headstock part. So I have a reference point. Now what I'm going to do is route the truss rod channel. This is my Triton router. I've got it set up with a 1/4 inch bit. I've got a vacuum attachment here. I have this router specifically set up to do Les Paul necks. Make sure I've got the depth set right. It's just about perfect. I always leave probably a 1/16 in, so it'll move around just a bit if you need it as you're working on the guitar. I've already got my side piece already set to the middle because I've been running the same consistent wood through the same process. So I know exactly where this is centered. You know, you want to make sure you get this centered in the piece of wood. I'll clamp down. I'm going to take my truss rod, I'm going to mark where it is, so you don't want that truss rod sticking out. So you leave about 3/16 for the nut. Line it up where the center line is. Go about maybe a 1/4 inch past, so you've got a little room to play with. And now I know I need to route from here to here. So the only really difficult part is routing this spot right here. You could route the piece of wood before you do the headstock angle. You know, I just like doing the headstock angle first because that is the most difficult setup And once I've got that done, I can process all this wood, put my table saw away. So now the only thing that I'll have to do is actually just chisel out a little bit where the truss rod head is, but for the most part, perfect fit. Now what I'll do is I'll take this upstairs to the Laguna bandsaw and cut out the profiles here. So it's really important when you're cutting the necks on the bandsaws is that you save the insides. This is from a previous neck that I had cut, same piece of wood. What I do is I end up taking the inside and I run a cut to create the wings, so that way I can get the actual grain pattern to match up on the front and the back side. You know, it's really important for the back side, not so much the front, but I like to have it matched. This is my back profile jig, and essentially what it is, it's just a upgraded version of this with some back bracing and some hold down clamps. So that way I've got a process, clamp this in, make sure that it's lined up correctly on the angled cut here for the headstock, clamp it down, make sure that it's flat, you know, with a level here, that it's not sticking out 1/4 of an inch anyway, and boom, I can take this over to my router and route the profile. Two things that I like to do: number one is keep the volute, so that way customers can use it if they like. You know, this is definitely one of the weak spots of Gibson's guitars, so I keep it. Customers can always sand it off if they need it, if they don't like it. And then I always put a 1/16 thick strip here, so that way if customers are looking to do a little bit fatter boat neck, this is on there. So what you'll see is this is the standard profile. So now I'll take this over to the router. All the routing that you'll see me do with this video is on a custom table router that I made. Essentially it's just a Porter cable router mounted to the bottom of this. I drilled a hole in this melamine top, and then I've got a 7/8 slight spiral bit with a bunch of bearings to give me essentially a big template router. So it's safe, it's in the bottom is screwed in here in these 3 points. I've got a special safety stop switch, and I will have to raise and adjust this when I'm doing my different profiles to make sure that I'm getting the correct height. But I just make 2 adjustments. One, when I'm doing the lower part, and 2, you know, I pick it up to the top and route the top. So I go through these bits quite often. It's usually a bottom bearing bit. I take the bit off and I mount the bearings on the bottom, and then I can get all my routing done. I probably go through one of these every couple months. So now once I profile this, it's time to glue the wings on. So I take my wings from before, I find the side that's flat, that's not actually been cut, line it up, these are a little bit thick. What I'll do is I'll actually clamp this down to the granite plate, and I'll clamp going across. That way I know I've got a perfect flat face. So I'll do that here next. Alright, so here we are, about 6 hours later. Clamp this real quick. Stuck to the table. Quick pop. Here you can see it's glued in pretty nicely. Once I sand this down, you'll lose all of that. Reason for the difference in coloration is that these necks have been sitting out for about 1.5 years, and I just freshly cut the wings, so over time these will darken up. So the next jig I go to is my Tenon Cutting Jig, and I've already got a video of this posted, but essentially it's a 90-degree top coming off a bottom, and I take a 4.5-degree wedge here, and I put it on the bottom going down like this, and I take my saw and I cut the perfect tenon. So I've got it clamped on the bottom here. What's nice about the way this jig is set up is I can use 2.5 degrees, I can use 3 degrees, 4 degrees, I can use this flat if I'm cutting like a blues hawk tenon or whatever. This will cut a perfect angle on each side using just a straight saw. So I got my favorite shark saw. I'm just going to cut to the inside of the tenon. Do that on this side here as well. And that's it. I've got perfect 4.5 degrees on each side here. Just take a chisel and I'll clean up the back side. And as long as you got a flat body, this will fit right up perfectly. See here you can see the whole jig. I've got the piece of wood flush against the side here. I've got it clamped down. It's also screwed to my big table so that as I'm cutting, I'm really not going to get much movement on this board at all. So this is the Claro walnut body that I'm trying to match this neck to. And since I've already got this tenon cut, my jig is a little bit wider. So I want to cut this freehand on the bandsaw. So I've got this set up so that it's both on the center of each side. So what I'll do is I'll cut this and I'll just keep going back until it fits. This is the heart-shaped Claro. Fat on this side and cut a little bit more. When you're fitting the tenon, it's definitely going back and forth forth so it gets the right fit. You can shave this a number of ways. You can do this on a bandsaw, you can do it by hand. So this is pretty close to perfect. What I'll do is I'll file some of this down, sand it so it's a little bit smoother. You don't want to ever have a neck that's this tight in the neck pocket. I love when guys show that they got it this tight. One thing I don't understand is how they actually glued in the neck, because as you add glue, the water in the glue makes the joint swell, and you get about this far and then you can't force the neck down and you've got garbage. So what Gibson does is they sand it just a little bit thinner so it actually fits, and what you'll see in some of the old guitars are actually pockets where the glue can escape. Alright, so now I'm going to clean up the tenon, specifically this little nip that sits out. I get my chisel, I'm just going to pop it off. That's it. What's really important when you're cleaning up the tenon is that you always want to take a little bit more from this area and from this area and from this area. That way, as you're forcing down the neck, you've got some room for the glue. And what I always do is I take my file and I clean up the edge as well. I pull just a little bit off this edge. So the glue has somewhere to go. So I don't take a whole lot, but I do enough that I've got enough room to force this down. And I'll give you an example of what Gibson does here. This is an old Gibson neck for a 335, I think. This is still in the roughed out phase. It's still real fat on every side here. But what they used to do is they would route this, and look how thin that tenon is compared to how thick that is. This is almost double the size. And they would go out and route on the insides here so that you get a perfect fit. Pretty small tenon compared to what they're doing these days. So I think this was a Norland era. So next, now what I'll do is I'll take this to my profile jig. So after the cut, I took the neck and all I did is just essentially just clamp down the body, or clamp down the neck into the body. It's still a little bit too tight, but you can see the perfect fit that I've got. All I gotta do is sand this off right here, and I've got pretty much a perfect fit. This is my side profile jig, and it's got the whole profile of the guitar neck up and down. So what I'll do is get the neck cut out, make sure everything's set up correctly. Place this sucker in here. Clamp it down. I use wedges on each side to make sure it's tight. And I'll take this to the bandsaw and I'll trim the edges, so that way the edges are as close to the lines as possible. That way when I take it to the router, I'm not stressing the router so much. I've already got most of the waste cut out. Lastly, what we're going to do here is we're going to route the headstock, and I've got a special jig that does that. I've got my center line running through, I've got my little book match. I'm going to place this onto my jig. Make sure it's lined up properly. Clamp it down. I'll screw it in here. And then, like you'll see in all of my jigs, these wedges are a lifesaver. Just pop these in. Now this neck ain't going anywhere. I can make sure it's lined up against my center line. And I'm looking pretty good here. So I've all set up. Just going to take this to my router and route this off. So there you go, in about half hour, 40 minutes, once you get all the jigs set up, I've got a perfectly good kit neck that the user can carve. You know, all the profiling is done correct. All you really got to do is, I just got to sand this down to clean this up, which you can do with pretty much any tool. And the carving can be done either via a spoke shave or a router bit, or you can use a file. But I always let that up to the user, you know, final buyer, because that's probably the most important piece. But here's a roughed out neck. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks, guys.